Today's VETgirl podcast is sponsored by Boehringer Ingelheim. Boehringer's animal health business provides first-in-class innovation for preventing and treating disease in animals. The company offers a wide range of vaccines, parasite control products, and medicines for pets, horses, and livestock to veterinarians, animal owners, farmers, and governments. As a leader in animal health, Boehringer Ingelheim values that the health of humans and animals is deeply connected and strives to make a difference for people, animals, and society. Learn more at boehringer-ingelheim.com/animal-health. Hi, VETgirl here today, and super excited to speak with Dr. Michael Dryden, who is a really famous parasitologist who I learned so much from finishing vet school. Gosh, that was 30 years ago, but really excited to talk about heartworm disease today. Now, I know people listen to this VETgirl podcast all over the world, so depending on where you live, there may be more prevalent heartworm disease. I live in Minnesota where our state bird is a mosquito, so we always worry about diarrhea. But before we jump into heartworm, let's introduce Dr. Michael Dryden. Dr. Dryden, thank you so much for joining us today for today's podcast.
I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you and all the listeners. And today we're going to be talking about heartworm disease in the United States. So it's going to be great. As you probably know, I spent 30 years teaching parasitology at Kansas State University, lectured on every topic of veterinary parasitology and traveled all over the world and multiple venues, lecture on everything from fleas to ticks to heartworm to Giardia and everything else. So looking forward to talking to you today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. As we know, diarrhea immitis is an extremely common and often life-threatening parasitic infection with around 1 million dogs testing positive for heartworms in the United States. Macrocyclic lactone preventatives have been available for heartworm disease prevention for more than 30 years. However, the disease still persists, and in certain regions of the country, I'm talking to you, Southeast United States, rates are increasing. When considering the increases, there are numerous factors that are involved that we'll talk about today. Additionally, questions still arise concerning resistance to heartworm disease preventatives, which is what makes me really concerned as both a pet owner and a veterinarian. So I'm really excited to talk to you about some of the insights into our changing understanding of heartworm infections in dogs and the opportunities that exist to provide better protection for our pet companions. So again, I did want to start by asking, what do we know about the current number of dogs testing positive for heartworm disease, and how does this compare to the past years?
Well, that's a really good question. I think what we recognize is that there are more dogs testing positive today than there was 10 years ago. And quite frankly, 10 years ago, there were more dogs testing positive than was 10 years prior to that. There's been a few national surveys. They're generally done by these national diagnostic companies because we're sending in large numbers of blood samples to them, like IDEXX, and they're getting over 1 million tests a year. And the last data they put out, about almost 1.3% of the dogs are testing are positive, which say, well, it's 1.3%, but there's 70 to 80 million pet dogs. So you do the math. That's in excess of 1 million dogs out there with 6 to 12-inch worms in their pulmonary arteries and right heart. But these are humans. I mean, this would be front page of the newspaper every day. I mean, think about that. You've got in excess of 1 million dogs with 12-inch worms in their right heart. That's just insane if you think about it. And it's tragic as well because it is virtually completely preventable.
That's interesting that you brought that up because I often thought, what a disgusting disease if this affected human medicine or humans, right? Now, I know that you had mentioned some of these incidence maps. In reference to the most recent heartworm incidence maps, I know the American Heartworm Society notes it's clear that rates have continued to trend upward in both heartworm hotspots and in locales where heartworm cases were once rare. What are some of the factors or reasons for this increase in spread of heartworm cases?
Yeah, heartworm, like we said before, it clearly increased. Depending on the data, somewhere between 15 to 21% increase over the last decade, which is incredible to think about it. And it's also continued to spread northward. But there are a variety of factors. The one we just cannot ignore, and again, this is kind of it's a good thing, bad thing, if you will, and that is dog relocation. As we know, this happened over the last couple of decades. A lot of the animal shelters have become no-kill shelters, and they're doing everything they can to find homes for these displaced pets and abandoned pets. And again, that's a good thing. But on the other hand, we know that most of those shelters are in the southern part of the United States. That's just a fact. And then those dogs are being relocated to other places all throughout North America, United States, and even into Canada. And we know, based upon a large study done by University of Florida a number of years ago, after the Hurricane Katrina episode, almost half of those dogs that are transported are heartworm positive. And that's an underestimation because a lot of those dogs were under 6 months of age, and so a heartworm test is basically invalid at that point. So, in excess of 50% of these dogs are being relocated are heartworm positive. And they're going to places often historically where practitioners aren't as attuned to heartworm. And so once those dogs drop into those locations, as we all know, often when people adopt an animal, they don't immediately take it to a veterinarian. It may be a year later before they show up at the veterinary practice, which is actually probably more common. That gives that dog, if it's got microfilaria, a year to be a reservoir. And that's, I think we can't underestimate what's happened over the last, well, since 2005, after the Katrina episodes and everything's happened since. We can't underestimate that. In fact, I'm not sure we could even overestimate the impact that has had upon heartworm spread in this country. So I think we recognize that. The other issue is the well-known and well-documented effect. We've often called it the urban heat island effect. That is, in inner cities, downtown urban areas, because of all the buildings and cement, they're warmer. This is a well-documented phenomenon. And as urban centers have undergone urban sprawl and have spread out, we're increasing the downtown temperatures. And when you warm up the temperatures, mosquitoes live longer and we have higher temperatures. So mosquitoes can actually develop the heartworm within the mosquitoes. They've got to have at least 57 degrees Fahrenheit on an average in order for the microflurry to develop. And so as these warm up, that's going to happen. There was a great study out of Chicago published just a few years ago that showed that from the outskirts of metropolitan Chicago to right to downtown, almost next to the lake, which is kind of crazy, the farther you went downtown, the longer the heartworm transmission season was, because the suburbs are actually cooler than downtown because of urban heat island effect. And by the time that 16-year study was done, almost 2/3 of the coyotes in the Chicago metropolitan area were heartworm positive. And so, I mean, these are just incredible to think about those factors. We also recognize that as climatic fluctuations have occurred over the last few decades, and we've also had new mosquito species introduced into the United States, they have spread northward as well. There are at least 25 different species of mosquitoes in the United States that can transmit heartworm. So this becomes a very complex situation, yeah, if you think about it. And we can't underestimate also compliance. Compliance is a major factor here. Compliance rates appear to be going down. And a lot of that may be, quite frankly, an economic driven situation. If you've got more than one dog or cat in your household, it does become expensive to maintain year round heartworm compliance in a number of pets. So, it'd be nice if I could pick one thing. If I could say it's climate, it'd be easy. If I could pick mosquitoes, that'd be easy. But you can't pick one thing. There are a variety of factors, and I just talked about four here that are well recognized, well published on, that we know is contributing to the increased expansion of heartworm in the United States and Canada.
All amazing points that you bring up. I adopted my pit bull from Joplin, Missouri when one of the hurricanes hit there. I remember seeing a lot of dogs from the southeast move up out of shelters into northern Minnesota, because if I was going to stereotype about Minnesota, pet owners are very compliant. All their dogs are spayed and neutered and on preventative. But interestingly enough, our shelters are often empty. So we're often filling them from the southern United States. And I honestly rarely see heartworm as a criticalist. And I remember having these dogs come into the ER post Katrina that were usually, pit bull mixes. They had already received their first dose of treatment, or they had really severe cable syndrome or really severe clinical signs. And it was so unusual for us to treat heartworm in Minnesota, again, even though our state bird is the mosquito. So again, I definitely clinically saw that too. And so interesting that you bring up coyotes. I live in St. Paul, right in the city, and we have coyotes walking around all the time, right? Because we're right next to the Mississippi. And that's something that we often forget about is wildlife spread. Now, I did want to ask, you talked about compliance. How does compliance factor into the number of heartworm positive dogs that we have in the United States? You brought up, most people probably aren't finishing their whole annual or 12-month medication. We've all heard it where they're like, oh no, I have leftover. And with the growing cost of pet care, I'm sure that's an issue. But how does that compliance really affect the heartworm numbers?
I think it's directly related to the heartworm numbers along with everything else. It's one of the major factors. And there's a couple things here that have to be considered. And I don't want to rag on and put down pet owners. I mean, we're all pet owners ourselves. We understand all the issues related to that. And I don't want to pick on a lot of practices, but we have to understand that there's really two types of compliance in my mind. What I call client compliance, and then I have what I call clinic compliance. And I think we fail at both. Client compliance is they purchased the product and did they give the product? And that's a number we can never get at. There's just no way to accurately assess how regular clients are often given the medication. Anecdotally, every one of us was in private practice. We'll tell you, has innumerable stories about the client that comes in and, like you just said, well, it's time to re-up your heart and preventive, and they go, well, I still have 4 pills left, and you look up and they bought 6 a year ago. Okay, whatever. So we've all got those anecdotal reports, and I think we all recognize that. But getting to what that real number is very, very difficult. The other issue that we face is how forcefully, if you will, I'll use that terminology, did that clinic make sure the client walked out with prevention or at least purchased prevention from some direct-to-home shipping service? And there's a variety of those out there now. Or did we just kind of roll over and go, okay, I understand, and any little pushback we get, we don't push the product out the door. But clearly, if we're not giving prevention, we're not going to prevent heartworm. I mean, that's a one-to-one situation, and often not just as simple as that. You live up in Minnesota, and we often think about, well, yes, in the South we have a year-round heartworm transmission season, and in the North we don't have a year-round heartworm transmission season. And there was that classic work that was done looking at heartworm transmission by Knight and Locke a number of years ago that showed that in some of these northern states, maybe you've only got 3, 4, 5 months of transmission. Well, as beautiful and elegant and as scientific as that work was, it was flawed in the fact that the primary thing is they used a specific mosquito species, and they said, well, the average lifespan of mosquito is 30 days. And so it's only got 30 days to develop enough what we call heat units for that microflurry to develop to the L3. Well, the problem with that is we have a number of mosquito species in this country that are heartworm transmitters that live 2, 3, even 4 months. And so once you understand that a mosquito could live for 3 months and that larvae could develop over a 3 month period, not a 30-day period, that changes heartworm transmission dramatically. You've now gone from a 3 to 4 month season to a 6 to 7 month season. Okay. Or we talked earlier about the urban heat island effect, where downtown, it's warmer temperatures than what maybe some of the temperature probes would tell us. It's actually even warmer down there. And then you got all these little microclimates. So trying to seasonally time heartworm transmission, it just doesn't work. Never has. Like we said, wouldn't have 1 million+ dogs with heartworm. It just doesn't work. So there's a variety of factors in compliance. I mean, we talk about client compliance, we can talk about clinic compliance, and we can talk about just a misunderstanding of when we need to do compliance. You add all that together, and there's no reason that we are struggling mightily with this very, very important disease.
You bring up and you reiterate such key points again. And I will say I'm old school. I still use the stickers and put them in my journal. And if I don't do that, I can't remember. And I know there's technology where there's reminders that are sent out. But I always say we as veterinarians and as veterinary technicians and pet owners should always be empathetic, because sometimes life is just overwhelming and sometimes pet owners truly forget. I remember when I had first delivered my son and I was recovering from C-section, it was months later, probably 6 months later, where my husband said, who's not a veterinarian, he said, I haven't seen you give the heartworm medication in a long time. And I looked through my journal. I was like, oh my God. And I'm going to blame a pregnancy or mom brain. But I actually took my dog straight to the ER to get him tested because it had been over 6 months. So sometimes
Yeah,
life just gets crazy. But again, it's so important that we educate our pet owners about that.
yeah, you're absolutely right. And this relates not only to heartworm today, but we've also seen these things with flea and tick control as well. And that's one other thing. I know we're talking about heartworm today, but it's very similar. The data shows us that administration of flea products and tick products drops dramatically in the early fall. And a lot of it has to do with, quite frankly, just kids going back to school and people getting busy in their lives in that time of year, in that transition period. Even though the fall is our biggest flea season that we've got, Okay, and it's also a major heartworm transmission season. So if you know if they forgot and stopped giving their flea treatment, they forgot and stopped giving their heartworm treatment at the same time. So it's amazing to see that data, and I think it correlates, quite frankly. The major drop off we see from August to September to October in administration of flea products, like I said before, if they're forgetting their flea product, you know they're forgetting their heartworm product at the same time.
Totally agree. In fact, living in Minnesota, we also have really severe tick infestation, and obviously a ton of deer, a ton of woods up here, a ton of lakes. And for me, I don't stop my flea and tick preventative until November. It has to have at least 1 month of a really hard frost. And by November, we're already snowing and super cold in Minnesota. But again, really, really important to reiterate that to pet owners. Now, year-round preventative. I wanted to talk to you about that. Do you have any tips or what do you recommend that veterinarians and veterinary technicians do to educate pet owners about the significant threat of heartworm disease and the critical need that their patients and their pets have to be on heartworm disease prevention year round?
That's a good question. Because obviously we've been trying to do this for 40 plus years, and we've not made a lot of great headway. I like to say we do, but we have not made a great headway there. In some respects, and this is where I was asked this question at a lecture down in Florida just a couple of days ago, is we've got a number of these new multimodality flea and tick heartworm products that are coming out. Okay, we've got some Trio, we got NexGard Plus, we now have the new Cordelia Quattro. And somebody was asking me what I thought about those products. And as a purist, if you will, purist parasitologist, I said, I would prefer to mix and match and do what I need to do when I need to do it. And that sounds great from an ivory tower standpoint, but it doesn't work. It doesn't always work that way in the real world in private practice. Clients want things simple and easy if you can. So in some regards, these multimodalities hopefully may help us as we move forward, and I'll explain why I think that is. We can talk about heartworm. Okay. And then we have pushback with the heartworm. Well, it gets cold in the fall. It's still a little snowing in the spring, whatever. But now we can talk about fleas as well. When's the flea season? So with a multimodality type of platforms that we now have out there, and I just mentioned the three that we've got currently right now, we're not just talking to the owner about just heartworm prevention. We're talking about heartworm, flea, and tick prevention, all of them together, and also the intestinal nematodes as well, because all these products also provide activity against hookworms and roundworms as well. So more of a broad spectrum parasite preventative type of an approach. And as I often say, the seasons don't perfectly overlap. They don't do that. Some are longer, some are shorter. So we're talking about a total medical prevention package for your pet. So if the old heartworm message ain't working for you, try this basically a more of a broad spectrum medicine type of preventative approach.
Love it. At least for me, whenever one of my colleagues says, or from one of my friends who's not in the veterinary field says, "Oh, I just had this stray cat that came into our house and I'm going to adopt." For me, I'm just paranoid about bringing in fleas. So it's something that we oftentimes forget about. The other barrier I see is us as veterinarians not appropriately educating our team to make sure that we have the same messaging. Because sometimes I will see some of our staff, some of our veterinary technicians, our front desk staff who only have their own pets on 6 months of heartworm preventative. And, if we're not making sure that the message is clear across our entire team, there's going to be breakdowns in communication. So I think that's also really important. Now, we've been hearing reports about macrocyclic lactone resistant isolates of heartworms. What do we currently know about this topic?
Well, we're knowing more and more all the time. I'll start with that. Well, first of all, it's real. So macrocyclic lactone resistance is a real phenomenon, been well documented. Primarily occurs in what we call the lower Mississippi Delta region. And, even professionals, parasitologists, argue about exactly what that region is, how far north does it go, probably a little bit north of St. Louis. How wide does it go? Clearly encompasses Memphis. It may drop over into parts of eastern Alabama and East Texas, but whatever it is that lower Mississippi Delta region where the vast majority of these cases have occurred. Been well documented. We also see what I call one-offs other places. A case might pop up here or there someplace else, but there's no focal area. They're kind of one-offs and maybe related to dog movement, though we don't really know for sure. So there's only really one area that this is an endemic area, and it has been since at least 2005, which has kind of baffled a lot of people why this hasn't moved. Contrasted to Ancylosperm caninum hookworm resistance, which is now found in every state in the United States and most of the Canadian provinces, which is crazy how fast it moved. But heartworm resistance has not moved dramatically, which is a good thing. Thank goodness for that. But in that region of the country that it does exist, every heartworm product has failed, at least in one of the studies, one of the trials. This is a class-wide effect. There's no doubt about that. Every one of the molecules that we use for harm prevention, be that selamectin, ivermectin, milmycin, oxime, moxidectin, every one of them has failed at least in some trial in some situation. So it's a real phenomenon. Luckily, it's been localized. It's been localized now for almost 20 years for whatever reason. But in that area of the country, it's concerning, clearly is.
While COVID was going on, I remember saying to a few veterinary colleagues, I worry about the day when there's increased resistance to ivermectin, to doxycycline, and some of the more common drugs that we use. So this is scary and something we need to be aware of. Now, while we believe that resistance is not widespread, are there certain active ingredients that you recommend for heartworm disease prevention when macrocyclic lactone resistant heartworms are believed to be a problem in that area?
Yes, there is actually. So if you look across the spectrum of the studies that have been done and what's going on clinically down in that part of the country, as I said, where every product, every modality has failed at least once, if not more than that. This is the terminology I use, and not everybody agrees with it, but that's fine. It's my terminology. I think there's one molecule that's failed the least. How's that? and that one molecule that's failed the least is moxidectin. Okay, and so we recognize that if you look at those various studies, that while everything had problems, it tends to perform better against a lot of these isolates than some of the other modalities. But even there's isolates that it's failed against. In fact, there's one now almost world famous isolate was collected, actually, I think just outside of St. Louis. They call it JYD 34. And yes, JYD does stand for junkyard dog, if you've ever heard that, because it was collected from a junkyard dog. That's why it's called JYD. So JYD 34, every modality has failed against it, including single dose moxidectin. Even very, very high doses of moxidectin are not 100%, even up to 100 milligrams per kilogram body weight doesn't even do it as well. So, but moxidectin is the best against those. And what they have found, quite frankly, is while single doses of even these new orals are not 100%, talked about before, the Simparica Trio, Cordillera Quattro, NexGard Plus, even though those single doses, which range from 12 to 24 microgram per kilogram, even those are not 100%, if you give them monthly for a number of months, 4, 5, 6 months, then the efficacy against even JYD rises above 90%. Okay. And so one of the secrets is that in that area, it's not only picking the right macrocytic lactone, if you will, it's also making sure compliance is there. Okay. Because single doses are horrible. I mean, single doses might only be 33 to 50%. But if you give them consistently, we're now rising well above 90% efficacy, even against the hottest isolate that's ever been found, which is JYD. So, and it goes back to what we've talked about earlier: compliance, compliance, compliance. Okay. So use the right products in that region and use them consistently. Now, once you leave that region, I'm going to make sure we're clear here. Once you leave that region, there's no evidence that we've got resistance out there. There's not. Okay. So heartworm preventive products are 100% effective across the vast majority of North America. And we need to remember that. And it goes back, why are we seeing failures? Compliance. Over and over and over again, we've got to do this appropriately. So I try to tell practitioners, if you don't live in that region, don't worry about this. Be compliant. The other thing I want to add this in right now, because I think this is critically important, because this came up in both the meetings I gave down in Florida, is that I was asked about clients who don't want to test their dogs on an annual basis. Okay. They're on prevention. We've told them how good prevention is, and they come in and go, why do I have to pay for a heartworm test? Okay. Well, the big issue we face is we're never going to know whether resistance is popping up someplace if we're not testing. We're never going to know where our compliance is if we're not testing. And we clearly don't want a dog popping up with microfilaria as a reservoir for heartworm in an area that maybe has a resistant isolate, and we don't know it for a year or longer, and now we've spread it into a locale. So annual testing, both antigen testing and microfilaria testing, is part of clinic compliance, as far as I'm concerned.
Great information. I was taught by Dwight Bowman, and he put the fear of God in us when it comes to heartworm testing. So, again, so important that our team be consistent in our treatment modalities, with our compliance, with our client education. Great information. And again, really appreciate you being on today's VETgirl podcast, Dr. Dryden.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks a lot. I hope we've disseminated some good information today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
NexGard Plus, alfoxylaner, moxidectin, and pyrentyl chewable tablets is for use in dogs only. The most frequently reported adverse reactions include diarrhea, vomiting, lethargy, and itching. Use with caution in dogs with a history of seizures or neurologic disorders. Dogs should be tested for existing heartworm infection prior to starting a preventative. For more information, including full prescribing information, talk to your veterinarian or call 888 637 4251 or visit www.nextguardplusclinic.com.